sit back in your seats, get something to eat, and watch this movie. Don't let the kiddies see it, because, well, we'll let you hear the beginning first. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Left of the Projector. I am your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. I am grateful for all of you who support the show, which you can do at patreon.com/leftoftheprojectorpod. You can follow and rate on leftoftheprojector.com. Your support and ratings and reviews are greatly appreciated. This week on the show, we are discussing the 1995 Michael Mann film, Heat. It has an all-star cast, and suffice to say, it has Pacino and De Niro in it. What else can you say? My guests this week are Keith, who you may remember from the episode on Predator and Predators. My second guest is Matthew Solomon. Matthew is a filmmaker, most recently made a documentary entitled Reimagining Safety. Now his work involves utilizing art to influence positive change. Matthew is currently an adjunct professor at Antioch University, where he teaches conflict resolution and intercultural conflict. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. All right, well, thank you for being here, Matthew and Keith.
Yeah, thrilled.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, as I mentioned in the opening, we're talking about the 95 film by Michael Mann, Heat, one of those, quintessential 90s action movies. But I guess before we jump into the movie, I also mentioned in the opening that you, Matthew, have a documentary that you might want to tell folks about, the Reimagining Safety, because before we jump in.
Yeah, thanks. And it'll tie in because Reimagining Safety is about alternatives to policing. And it's a documentary that highlights the harms that policing and incarceration causes. It talks about the history of policing and also how we're socialized into thinking that police are only alternatives, and until we start looking further. But then it also gets into what the actual alternatives are and how people actually produce real safety in their communities through dignity and care and restorative justice practices and community response and things like that. And so I was a professional musician, thought I was done with entertainment, went into a master's in public administration program, thinking I would get into government or policy or something. And most of my focus was on the issues with policing, and went down the abolition rabbit hole and got really interested in the alternatives and, got additionally radicalized. I've been radicalized over the decades. But then when it came time to do my final thesis, one of my academic advisors was like, we know you know how to write a paper, but we know you're a filmmaker. So why don't you do something creative and do a documentary? And I laughed because I was like, that's a lot of work. And she said, well, do it anyway. And so I did. And, I don't know, I'm just very fortunate. The documentary, we've screened it across the country to date 57 times with over 70 organizations, from social justice organizations, mental health, housing organizations and things like that. And then it's been released on Amazon, Tubi, YouTube, and Google Play. But Heat is one of my all-time favorite films, and I'm really excited to dissect this.
Yeah, no, I'll put links to all those kind of things. And I guess what you're saying is there is an alternative to Al Pacino's character in this, and maybe, some other options. But I guess since obviously we're talking about Heat, which is, I actually got into an argument with someone recently, whether it's an action movie, whether it's a heist movie, whether it's a drama, and I don't know, it kind of fits into a bunch of different boxes. But I'm wondering, other than this movie, do you have any other favorite, I guess, heist movie, being that this is kind of sort of a heist movie, even though I think it's so much more than that?
I mean, there are a lot, Dead Presidents comes to mind, but if I had to pick one, it would be Point Break. And it's like the LA bank robbery, surfer, skydiver, the spiritual part, like Bodhi and his spiritual quest and all of that. I went through, my whole Zen, exploring Buddhism and other religions and stuff. I went through that whole thing in my life. And so, Point Break would probably be my heist movie that's right under Heat.
Yeah, no, I don't want to be too, sort of blockbuster commercial. I mean, I think I'm always like pretty big defender of like Ocean's 11 as just like both great heist movie and also just like
Yeah.
a great gotcha ending, right? With like the reveal that like, all the 911 call is staged and things like that. Actually, Point Break, I mean, that's a great answer. That is a truly great answer. I mean, it is like, this long burn of a heist movie, sort of dramatic endings, things like that. I mean, Inside Man, I think is obviously a pretty sort of solid choice.
Oh,
Mhm.
that's what I was going to say. You took it out
Yeah.
of my mouth.
But no, I mean, yeah, although I don't know that any of those I would say I like as much as Heat. I mean, Heat is truly just kind of like
Mhm.
just such a well done kind of like, dramatic narrative that just like really draws you in with this, sort of sense of like, both fatalism, but also just, sort of, just, I mean, incredible shootout scene, right? Possibly like one of the best ever.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And it's like it's a 3-hour movie, but it doesn't feel like it, and there are so many side plots and different stories woven in, but it all makes sense. So like however, because with me as a filmmaker, I always want to edit things down and make it as tight as possible. But this movie just breathes in a lot of ways that are really important, I think.
It would be impossible for me to really sketch out this entire movie. As we also said, it's 3 hours, 3 hour plus, or almost 3 hours. There's multiple woven in sort of storylines and all of this. But one of the things that kind of, looking through, just the movie itself, and I'm wondering, when I think of it, I think of just like the harsh reality of sort of the real world of all these different people from different walks of life. You have the police, you have the former convicts, and you have all these other, their spouses and the people kind of in the periphery. And it's all this interwoven thing. And I wonder if, is as much of the as much real, kind of in quotes as it kind of feels. I mean, do you think that does it like, is this, realistic, I guess, is more the question of, how these kinds of people, obviously it's a fictional story, but these kind of characters, do they feel, real in the actions and things that they have to take, I guess. My question was as long as the movie.
I mean, so I've always been fascinated with relationships and how people relate to each other. I actually was a relationship coach for a while before that's how I got into conflict resolution, interestingly. And so, watching the film, like the married couples and the stuff that they're dealing with, and like it's all very real. And I've the cop mentality of, I gotta, keep the anger because it keeps me sharp, and I can't, be soft and open up because there's bad guys. Like that's for real. I've spent time with cops, unfortunately, but that's very real. And then on the flip side, the De Niro and like his crew and they're do like that's what they do. And like to me, I think that's one of the things, like when we're talking about all the various levels. Yeah, like even Van Zant, right? He's like this tough guy. He wants to be seen as this tough guy. And they steal his bearer bonds, and he's like, oh, words out on the street, you can steal my stuff. But then, like, he's scared. He's living out of his office because he knows, like, people are after him. And so, like, everybody's multidimensional in the film, which makes it real.
Yeah, and it definitely does have like a strong sense of realism. I mean, I guess one thing I did question coming out of it, and I don't know as much about like law enforcement and like, sort of like criminal behavior, but like the sense is like, how much of does this exist? This idea of like these well disciplined, very coherent like crime crews, right? Like that's one thing that I feel like it's possible that the movie kind of oversells as like this idea of like this highly professionalized squad, right? And they've got this fence who is like almost has this like, godfather mentor like relationship with them, and has all these sort of connections, and they talk about like, oh, Pacino took down these other crews, and like this sense of like a well sort of organized, coherent kind of criminal community seemed to me sort of one question I have is not knowing like is that really a thing? Like, are we really aware of like these like sort of highly organized, non-mafia sort of sort of cells that exist? Like, I'm not, obviously I'm not sure, but that is one question I walked away from the movie. Like, is this actually a thing? Because I don't feel like I read in the news about like things of this nature, but
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I hadn't really thought of that. The thing is, so I live in LA, I grew up in LA, and I forget what year it was, but several years after Heat came out, there was a North Hollywood bank robbery with these two guys that were heavily armed with automatic weapons and body armor. And the cops they couldn't compete. So they actually had to go into a local gun shop and get like high powered rifles and things like that. And so you see things like that, but yeah, the whole organization of the crime and the what's his name, John Voight, like his character Nate, like he ties it all together and gets them to out. Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I would think something like that exists, but yeah, I don't know how prevalent it is.
I mean, that's kind of like a Michael Mann thing. I mean, I think of his first movie, Thief, is very much a similar, like a smaller level crew but more so just one or two guys, kind of going together. And I don't know. I mean, I certainly doubt that there is any kind of seriously organized type of cells like this, but I can tell you it makes for a hell of an entertaining, 3 hours of time. Yeah, I'm not trying to.
It's a great plot device because you get this sense of like them as having this kind of allegiance to each other, right? This sense of like responsibility for what happens to one another that definitely, would not really sort of work narratively if is a much more just sort of like, contingent kind of, criminal gang type thing, right? I mean, this idea that this is like this quasi family for them, right? They all go out to dinner, they all sort of know each other's like kids and stuff like that is, I mean, it's very compelling and it makes for a great story. Like I just said, the sense of like, is that like realistic? Do those like outside of like the mafia and like actual like, sort of crime families, is that actually something that like is like, real in the world of criminality? I'm just, that just is something I've always been curious about, although, can't answer that definitively in any way.
I've known a couple people that have held up banks. And their crews are tight, and yeah, but there wasn't like an outside element that was like, okay, here's what you do and here's how you dismantle the alarm system and all of that. But
Yeah.
I know the crews are tight, but yeah, that extra level, that layer, yeah, it's interesting.
I think about this a lot with, especially movies with cops, this being especially a Pacino, De Niro, kind of as the opposite sides. I guess I wonder, as I was watching this, you often say sort of like the good guy versus bad guy kind of thing. And sometimes in a film where the bad guy is sort of like this anti-hero. And I'm wondering if you see De Niro's character as this sort of anti-hero or I mean, he has this connection to all of his family and his friends and his crew and everything. But at the end of the day, he is this loner kind of person. I think he says he's lonely, but he's not alone, I think is one of the things he says at one point.
Yeah,
but
to Edie, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you think he's sort of like this. I hate to use like bad guy, good guy, because that's such like a black and white thing, but I'm wondering how you see De Niro, because sometimes like in Thief with Michael Mann's movie, the Can is sort of, he goes to this line of business, of this work, because he has no other choice. He has no other way of making it. He might have gotten in trouble as a kid and your whole life might be ruined for you. So this is what probably happened to De Niro. So wondering what you guys think.
I don't see him as a bad guy. It's interesting though. I was listening Michael Mann's commentary of the shootout scene. He refers to De Niro's character as a sociopath, and I was like, wow, that's interesting. That he, and his thing was, he loves his crew and he'll do anything for them, but whoever's in the way, like they're just collateral damage or whatever. But I also, I see De Niro's character as, this is the life he fell into. Because it's interesting. There's this one scene, I think it's in the coffee shop. Yeah, it's in the coffee shop where, they're both like, yeah, this is what I do and this is what you do and this is what, and I don't want to do anything different. But then after that, De Niro makes the comment where he wants to, this isn't the life that he wants to live, and he wants to get started on something else with, with Edie is what he alludes to. So yeah, it's like the life that he fell into or chose for whatever reason. But it's not like the end all be all for him.
I mean, yeah, no, I very much agree. I'm actually stunned to hear Mann described him as a sociopath, because I mean, that just sounds very incorrect. I mean, like even at the opening scene where it's clear he doesn't want to kill those guys, and I mean they're gonna off, the serial killer the actual sociopath. I'm forgetting his name in the film, but yeah, right. They're gonna off him out of anger that he just sort of arbitrarily killed those guards unnecessarily. So, I find that like surprising. And I guess I would say that like I can't help but feel like De Niro is like an anti-hero, right? Because I don't know about you, but like the end of the movie, always I'm just like, oh, I just wish he'd gotten away. Like, just so devastating that he got him. Like, and no matter what, I could like analyze, like my true feeling is that like, God, what a bummer. Like if only he's like, this could have played out some different way. Right. And I mean, I think, I do have this sense that like, they don't really flush out why he chose this life. He kind of obliquely alludes in the coffee shop scene to the fact that his family, right? He's like, my mom's dead. My dad was like, that he had clearly just had like a childhood that was, not stable. That is an indication of how he got into this, right? And then there's always this sense that for whatever it was that he got sent to prison, he had kind of found this like mentor who had kind of like explained to him to live this way, right? Like if you, the classic line that, nothing you can't leave if you, feel the heat like coming down on you, right? Like he had sort of picked up, it's almost as if he picked up these ideas and this code and how you live like from this sort of like prison family, this sort of sort of prison society, and that, he's sort of taken that into the world, although you're definitely not given a sense, of like, how he fell into this lifestyle from the beginning, where it's already clearly very well formed by the time the viewer enters.
I guess since we're talking about, the De Niro's character, and then I guess you have the sort of the person he's facing off against, Al Pacino as Lieutenant Hannah. And he, you have a very different sort of introduction to his character as this, he has a family, he's married. You learn later it's his third marriage, but he's married. He has I guess a stepdaughter, and he sort of has this life, but that's sort of not really his life as you sort of go through the movie. It's sort of what he goes to when he's not working because he's got to do something and he wants to have something that's stable, but really he doesn't. That's not him. It's sort of like his like this little armor. I think you mentioned, Matthew, how it's kind of or I don't know, one of you said they need something as kind of like motivation to do these, to get angry about things. And so I think he has to have something that's sort of like the brief time when he's not angry. He can go home and, drink or whatever and have sex with his wife and then just go back to work again. And he's like, I mean, you don't like him because he's like the quote unquote bad guy. He's the cop trying to take down De Niro and his crew, but he's also a pretty unlikable person, but does have like the moments where he saves, Natalie Portman's character. He's trying hard to find the serial killer too as well. So he kind of has these moments of seemingly goodness, of kind of a soft underbelly, I guess would be what I mean.
Yeah, and able to be soft with. So yeah, Natalie Portman. There's the like when the prostitute gets killed and like her mom shows up and like he hugs her and takes her away. Like he has these soft moments, but not with his wife.
I mean, it is this interesting kind of cinematic trope, right? It's like the cop who like defines themselves entirely by like the job. And so as a result, like can't form healthy human relationships because like their obsessiveness with like being like a cop essentially consumes their home life, right? I mean, I think a lot about like McNulty on The Wire and the whole like conversation at one point that he has with Lester Freeman. He's like, the job will not save you, right? Like you have to have something outside of this, right? And it's like kind of this moment of reckoning for McNulty, but I think I see Pacino as like a very similar character, right? This sense that like this is his universe, this is where he's decided like his life has meaning, and he can't like figure out how to form healthy bonds with people, which I think is indicative of the fact that he seems to have forms this affinity for De Niro, right? Like Pacino develops this like bromance with De Niro because I think in some ways he sees him as like a more akin character to himself than to like all the other straight-laced people around him, right?
He envies him, and he looks up to how he constantly is saying how like professional, how incredible they are, how everything they're doing is just, something he's probably never come across. And he's actually found someone who's like his equal, right? Like this is actually someone that he, it's especially having them sit down at that, the famous cafe diner scene which is also just I think also the first time they'd ever been in a scene together, which is almost hard to believe given their careers before that point. But, they have to have this person that is his equal, because otherwise it doesn't, he needs the chase. Like he doesn't have anything left to do except go after people. I mean, if once he captures him, what's he got left? A failing marriage and probably no other crime, syndicates that are ever going to be like this. Like this is kind of the end. I don't know. You don't obviously get to see what happens to him later, but it's just kind of you kind of see, I would see him as just kind of this downfall after.
Well, it kind of almost leaves it they're almost like both almost have this like adrenaline junkie aspect to their personalities, right? Like this is what they get off on. This is the rush of like doing this is what like makes them happy. That obviously they both share, but that obviously is like, like very destructive for both of them, in kind of different ways.
Yeah, there's that line about like, what do you want me to do? Go to ball games and have barbecues, or like that whole thing.
There's multiple times where he, it seems like when he comes home, to his wife, or I think there's that party scene or whatever it was when they go out to dinner and he has to leave to find the body of the woman killed by Waingro, and he comes back and he's cosplaying like a family person almost. Like that's not really what he is. He can't be that. And that actually leads me to kind of another like major theme that the De Niro and his crew have, which is like devotion and love for everyone in their orbit. Whereas what does Pacino actually love? I don't think he really loves his wife or his stepdaughter. I think he only loves his job.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair assessment, in the sense that like they're a kind of background to what he sees as like his real purpose, which is, to catch bad guys essentially. I mean, this might be the best movie ever to encapsulate the like cops and robbers dynamic, right? Like
yeah, and even like De Niro, like Val Kilmer's Chris, like his wife, when he finds out she's having an affair, and De Niro shows up and he's like, all right, you're going to give him one more chance. and if he messes up, I'll put you up I'll put you up, I'll pay your rent or whatever. So it is, wanting to keep everybody together and keep the people in his sphere, that his family, happy and together.
I was thinking about that too. Whether is that sort of this devotion and love for Val Kilmer's character and his wife, or is it also tied into just simply the fact that, if they become separated, it becomes a problem for him, as far as just being caught kind of thing. And I guess it kind of goes into this thing. Does he have this actual love for all these people? Or at the end of the day, is it simply a professional, thing? Because like you said, they go out to dinner together and they're doing all these things, but when they kind of break off, everyone goes home to their family, and he kind of has an empty apartment with no furniture in it. And
I would say that I think he does have a genuine, because otherwise the decision that ultimately leads to his, tragedy is to go after Waingro, right? And that has no utilitarian purpose. Like,
true.
It's purely just vengeance that, I can't help but see it being driven overwhelmingly by the fact that like this guy got, several of his best friends essentially killed, that they like set him up. When obviously
True.
the clearly the most selfish thing to do is to just get on the plane and head out and be safe. Whereas, he clearly is very, driven by this sense of betrayal towards these people that he care about. Otherwise, it's not really clear why he, kind of takes that risk. But
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And then there's that scene when they're deciding, like they realize the LAPD's onto them and they're having that conversation. Like, do we take this bank down or go our separate ways? And there's with Michael Cerrito, Tom Sizemore, where De Niro says to him, he's like, hey, if I were you, I would cut loose. You got a family, you got a kid, you got money, you got this. And so he gives him the out instead of, wanting him to be a part of the heist.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they do have multiple times where they could easily have walked away. And clearly they have, the exception of probably Val Kilmer's character, Chris, have money saved away. He's, it seems, a gambler and
Val
doesn't
Kilmer's
really have any
motivation
money.
to do the heist is clear, right? Everyone else, it's. But then I guess this is. I mean, I think that is one thing based on. I don't want to step on a question, so I'll just but this question of choice, right, and the decisions that the characters make is really a fascinating sort of aspect of the film. Yeah.
No, I mean that's a good point too. Like everyone does make choices, and as you said, Keith, the ultimate decision for De Niro to take vengeance leads to his death at the end of the film. And had he gone his own separate way, he probably would have lived happily ever after, and he would have been, I mean, at least for a time, he would have been happy and away from all of this. But all of the choices that each of them makes does have repercussions. I'd say probably the biggest one in the movie as far as kind of their choice. Dennis Haysbert, the guy who gets out of prison and he is getting a job just so he can, not, as part of his parole. And he makes a fucking terrible choice. Yeah. And, he makes a really bad choice. But was it even a choice? I mean, I guess we could probably go through multiple of the characters. Was it really a choice for him? He was getting, working for minimum wage, getting his ass yelled at, cleaning dishes and, sweeping the floor and doing grunt work that he was miserable at, but he was good at, being a getaway driver. And so he gets roped back in and it leads to his death. So,
yeah.
I mean, I do think that one of the things I really like about the movie is yes, that, each of them makes, they are presented with these clear choices that sort of define their fates. But you understand, within context, right? It makes sense, even though it may ultimately result in sort of tragedy, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect example, sort of Dennis Haysbert being he's in this shitty situation. He's getting taken advantage of by his boss because he's an ex-con. And, he's forced to do all this grunt work. And so in that moment, you could see why he would sort of make that decision, even if, in hindsight and obviously De Niro's decision. But to go back to that one moment, I do think that when the gang meets after they figure that the cops are on them. And, Tom Sizemore's character is he's I'm with you, boss, whatever you want to do. He's no, not this time. You have to decide what, he's you can't opt out of the decision. You have to. And I actually saw that as a very indicative of this is clearly a theme man really wanted to hammer home that each person kind of, for better or worse, has their sort of capacity for free will. This isn't a Greek tragedy, and some make sort of better choices than others, yet there's always some sense that they made this sort of they followed this path basically.
Yeah, it's interesting that, the whole thing about choice, this whole conversation is really fascinating because all the characters, Charlene, Ashley Judd, Chris's wife, she's battling with, do I choose to leave him? And then she's like, fine, screw it. To Hank Azaria's character, if you want me, we're here. Right. So there's that. And then she chooses to lie and say that it wasn't Chris who showed up. Right. And then, Justine, Pacino's wife in the film, she chooses to have the affair and she literally said, yeah, I chose to, degrade myself with Ralph. So it is, and then even Edie, there's a point where she's asking for De Niro to let her free. Are you going to let me change my mind, once, and so he's finally like, look, it's up to you. You can walk or you can stay, and then she chooses to stay. So yeah, it's really fascinating how that shows up.
And another one I think that's almost understated is like Pacino's final choice, right? Because he's at the hospital with Justine and Natalie Portman, who's obviously in dire straits, and his wife sort of posed like, "Do you think there's a way we could work this out?" Like it's this moment of possible reconciliation, right? And ultimately, not only does he kind of more or less pass, but like you would think like any sane person does not leave a hospital when your stepdaughter has just, attempted suicide, right? No, very few I'm sure he had some choice with like answering that job call. It could be like, I'm dealing with like a family member that's like dying, right? Like, and ultimately he decides that like, it's more important to him to go after Robert De Niro than to try and like stay there and patch up his marriage and be there for his stepdaughter, because this is ultimately like still what like his life is about, as opposed to this as Evan said, this kind of like family man he's tried to cosplay and clearly can't can't actually make it work.
I also wonder, like, there's that scene when De Niro's coming out of the hotel, when he goes after Waingro, he kills Waingro, and then he's coming out, like all the fire trucks and everything. And it's like, could he have gotten in the car with Edie and still gotten away, or were they too boxed in, or like, was there another, did he not realize that by parking there and pulling the fire alarm, that was going to bring everybody, like there's all of, when I watch it, like there's two scenes that baffle me. That's one of them. And then the other one is at the beginning, after the was it the money truck, after that, when they take Waingro out to the parking lot and they're going to kill him. And then the police car comes by. So he waits, and like literally Waingro's on the ground at De Niro's feet, and he's watching the car, and then he looks down and he's gone. And so for me, it's like, how did he not know that he got up? Like, that's the one scene that bothers me in the film, that just doesn't make sense. But
and he lost track of him, you mean?
Yeah, there are
you think you would kind of see him skulk off or like hear him moving or something.
Yeah, can see like he's this criminal mastermind, and he's the guy is like literally under his feet. And, they can't let him get. I mean, obviously it's
it's true. It is. It's kind of doesn't make a ton of sense. Yeah.
I guess we're talking about whether they have like a choice, like do they have agency over their own life? And then one of the other things, in addition to the choices of, I guess you mentioned, I guess Matthew, the Edie and Justine both kind of make decisions and choices. But I wonder also just about the female characters in this movie. You have, I think there's only, I guess a couple of the other wives are briefly in it, but for the most part, it's Ashley Judd's character, and you have Edie, and you have Justine, and then Natalie Portman. Like, what do you think? Do the women in the movie seem like they actually have sort of agency and, control over the things they're doing? Or is it more of a, the men, Al Pacino and De Niro and Val Kilmer with Ashley Judd sort of force them, I know force them is the wrong word, but sort of direct their actions more so and kind of take away their autonomy? I wonder.
I mean, let's be frank, this film would not pass the Bechdel test, right?
No,
but I mean, that said, I think they do have, like they also are like making their own decisions, right? Like Edie does not have to decide to run away with him, right? Like he doesn't force that ultimately on her. Like he won't let her take off because he's worried, she might run to the cops or something. And yeah, to go back to Ashley Judd's character, she could roll on Val Kilmer, right? And if anything, that's actually probably the best thing for her, right? But decides sort of ultimately not to. But then all of the decisions are, if you think about it, kind of revolved around like to what extent they like support the man and like go with like, sort of act in kind of, their best interest to sort of fulfill their like needs. Like, I think you could also argue that's probably the case, but
yeah, I think, it's from a relationship perspective, like they're really messy but real relationships. People get together they want to stay together. Things suck. So, somebody has an affair, or somebody gets distant or whatever. And so I see, like, for me, it adds to the realism, especially, I would say Justine, and because there are several scenes where she's like, I just want you to be present to Al Pacino. I just want you to show up. Like, this isn't right how you treat me, and she even says, like, she had her thing with Ralph because she needed an excuse, to divorce or whatever, they end up doing. So I just, like, for me, it just adds to the realism of it. It's like the hard decisions where you want to be there, you're invested in each other. There was love at one point, and then, but now what? So yeah, and actually Lily, Dennis Haysbert's wife or girlfriend or whatever, like, like, she's the one that's like, I believe in you, I'm proud of you, and he's like, why are you proud of me? And I feel for her in a lot of ways, maybe in different ways, I guess, than the other women in the film, because she was there and she was, like, really cheerleading for him, and then, to see that he's one of the bank robbers that got killed, while she's in a bar. Like, she doesn't know that he would, like, the other wives, like, they all know what their husbands are doing.
But I mean, this is sort of like stemming from the, like, sort of the question of, having their own choice, and kind of these, Michael Mann always kind of really builds these sort of complex male characters of maybe doing what they do because they have no choice. I think, again, like Thief being his first movie, and that's, James Caan's, like, entire character is this person who, he seems to do all the things he does because he has no other choice. And I guess, obviously this is a, podcast talking about sort of themes and ideas from sort of the leftist perspective. And I'm wondering what you think, or what you see as some of sort of the themes that run through that might not necessarily, I mean, I wouldn't say this movie is a leftist bent at all. I think Michael Mann's probably, I don't know exactly what his politics are. I don't think I looked into them. But I wonder, how you would see sort of the politics beyond where I kind of view it as, these, which we already talked about a bunch of, these characters that kind of have to turn to a life of crime because they don't really have any other choice. Like, they've had a bad childhood, they've gone to prison early on, and this is kind of what they're left with. There's no other alternative, just like Dennis Haysbert comes out of prison and he has no other choice. I mean, he can either work at a diner doing shit work, or he can, get back into a life of crime. So wondering how you would see any of those themes.
I guess one thing I think is really good about this film is that, like, even though, right, it follows the, like, natural arc of cops and robbers, and ultimately cop catches robber, right? Like, it does not present itself as, like, propaganda, right? There's not this sense that Pacino or law enforcement represent some, inherently moral, right, and righteous kind of pursuit, right? I mean, the one thing I like about the scene is you get this sense that, like, this is kind of a game, right? Like, this is the structure, this is the setup, but they don't make this sense that, like, somehow De Niro and his crew are violating this, like, moral order, this social compact, and the cops are, like, the force trying to maintain, like, civilization and society, right? It's much grayer than that. And if anything, like, there is this general sense on the part of the audience, I think you are kind of rooting for them to get away, right? I mean, I think there's, like, the shootout scene and they're all fleeing, and even Sizemore, and, like, you can't help but kind of think that, like, a lot of the audience is like, God, I hope they kind of get out of this, like, they're kind of trapped, right? And, also just the, general sense that, like, it definitely, I mean, the way they paint Van Zant, the business guy, right, definitely does not give this sense that, like, you should feel any empathy for the people they're robbing, or the, the sort of businesses and financial institutions as somehow, sort of aggrieved parties. If anything, they're painted as, like, just as kind of crooked and nefarious as the supposed, like, outlaws, right?
And it's all insured too. Right. They don't actually really lose anything
at
the end of the day.
Yeah. And it's all, like, high value scores. They're not knocking over liquor stores or, people's businesses or, breaking into houses. Yeah, it's like insured banks. It's Van Zant, who's a, I guess millionaire or whatever. Oh no, he has the offshore accounts. Like that's his thing.
He launders money for drug
He's like it came in
cartels, I guess.
It's like a
like
shady
that.
business.
Yeah, it came.
Clearly he's engaged in like nefarious, which is also why, to go back to the thing, that's why he was like, people on the street can't know you can just take my shit, right? Like it's a very kind of like criminal mentality about being robbed, where most business people will be like, well, insurance will, chalk it up, and he's like, nah, like I'm gonna kill these people. Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that those are both really good points. I think that in other Man films, I think this might be the 17th time I've referenced Thief, but I think in that movie, they also really paint police as, corrupt and needing to, shake down people to make a living. And they're not good people. I think you might say that Pacino is a good cop, and he doesn't seem to really sort of bend the rules. I mean, that's one thing he doesn't. He seems also kind of play by the book. They're all he directs all of his other staff to kind of do things, the way they should do them. They don't seem to do anything illegally. But yeah, I definitely don't think it's a positive portrayal of cops or like pro cop like you see in, I don't know, I can't think of a good example. One of hundreds you could probably think of, but I'm blanking.
I mean, I think you could argue, even as complex as it is, like almost The Wire is more propaganda in a lot of ways, right? I mean, The Wire comes much more as like, this is when they get the bad guy, it is a celebration of kind of the long pursuit that they were in, as opposed to the end of Heat, where it's much more a sense of like this tragedy that even Pacino, in holding his hand, recognizes as like, this sort of kindred spirit kind of, phenomenon. But yeah,
that's true. And then, and I guess you said the other point you said, Keith, was sort of like the Van Zant and these other kind of people they're stealing from are not necessarily good people. They are not, again, like you also said, Matthew, they're not stealing from some individual business or someone that could actually be hurt. When they rob the bank at the end, that's all FDIC, insured money. No individual's going to lose their money, some insurance company, and, who gives a shit about them too. So really at the end of the day, they're not really robbing from anyone. I don't know. They're not really giving their money to the poor like Robin Hood, but they're not, you don't really feel bad for any of the people they're robbing at any point.
And that was when I first saw the movie when it came out in the 90s, I was kind of struck how I was like, wait, I don't know who to root for. And because I had a different perspective then on policing and everything. So it was different to be like, yeah, I wanted De Niro to get away, and and all of that. And there were the cracks in Pacino's character, and like, yeah, I forget who said it earlier. Like, he's at the hospital with his stepdaughter who just attempted suicide, and he's like, all right, I'm gonna go after this guy. And the way he runs down the stairs, even like that shot is always like interesting. Like he's like flying down the stairs to go do this thing.
Oh, I was just saying, yeah, it's also interesting to think about like if in the logic of like policing, like it makes sense to confront a bunch of armed robbers with assault rifles in a highly crowded like area that's going to produce a lot. Like,
yeah,
I think you almost might want to be like, why don't we try and take them once they're like away from, but yeah.
Well, that reminds me, I think I had known this a while back, but I was looking into it. I mean, several of the scenes in the movie are used like in police and military training because of how incredible Michael Mann choreographed and all of the, I mean, we haven't even really mentioned, I mean, I guess we sort of mentioned, like, just as far as just as simply like visually of the movie, every scene and every moment and the shootout scene, of course, and all these things is like, it's beautifully shot. Everything is incredible. The acting, I mean, also too, like as far as the only other cast I can think of around this time that had like a better, top to bottom people, and it's only because I watched it last night, is True Romance, which has like every actor in it, but this has like a pretty stacked cast of people Pacino, Val Kilmer, De Niro, like even just like the Tom Noonan is kind of like this random guy who's giving them the bank information. He's like, oh, I collected from the satellites, and it just floats around out there.
It's all out there. Yeah.
Henry Rollins, Danny Trejo.
Yeah.
I mean, it just got, you mentioned before, Jeremy Piven is briefly in it too.
Yeah.
I mean,
like
it's got
illegal doctor.
the doctor. Yeah. I mean, it's literally has everyone you can think of.
Yeah. It's a really,
as somebody who's born and raised in LA, like this movie Collateral is another one that really, the way it's shot, it captures LA in like a really incredible, like beautiful aesthetic. True Romance was also, based in LA, like so yeah, there's something very like visually, for me in particular, that stands out. And then the bank shootout. I mean, I've been in downtown LA on that street. I've filmed around there. Like as a filmmaker, like dissecting that scene, they used the production audio of all the weapons and everything. And usually in a film, they film it, and then you have like the sound design, the sound effects people who come in, and they'll change out the gunshots to sound like more powerful or whatever, to make it more cinematic. And I heard a story several times that when they did that, it like sucked the life out of the scene. And so they ended up using the production audio, because you could hear like the echoes off the buildings. And it's very much like that, being downtown, you hear like horn honks, and it ricochets, just echoes and stuff. And so I remember that scene at that time was like everybody was like, that was the longest shootout ever, at that time. And it just went on and on and on. And it was very real,
No, I mean, I think the setting is also, I mean, it's much more of a overt theme in Collateral, right? But this kind of question about like setting in LA, and I'm also from Southern California. I didn't grow up in LA, but my brother lives there now. I've been there a bunch. Is, this idea about LA as a site to, like, as you see in like Collateral, to investigate these questions about like human loneliness, about like human disconnect from other people. That is, somehow a, condition inculcated by sprawl, right? And that's obviously like a very, very prominent theme in Collateral. But you wonder if that's also like kind of him bringing it to Heat, because so much of this idea is this question of like these characters who, are, inherently try to cultivate a sense of, being alone or loneliness, or this kind of like lone wolf sort of syndrome, right? And sort of, even in these worlds of like cops and robbers, the like difficulty of like forming, stable connections to other people. That, seems to be one of the things that man, really interrogates. And also, I think one of these things that people grasp or grapple with, who sort of, have this connection to Los Angeles.
Well, as someone who's not from California, from the East Coast, and I probably would be more relate to something that takes place, in New York or DC or, one of those East Coast cities. But when I think of especially man movies that take place in LA, which is, his go-to choice, I guess, except for Miami Vice. Maybe a couple other ones I can't think of at the moment. But when I think of LA and that sprawl that you're talking about, and just part of this city that just seems to have just suburbs and towns that kind of keeps on going, and it's just huge. It somehow, LA feels like the perfect city to have a character that has this sort of, that is lonely. Somehow I can picture someone being lonely in LA, but like that doesn't seem to work for me in New York somehow. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just in thinking of this movie as how much man, I don't know, maybe LA really does play into it far more than just, the scenes and the kind of the places that they're going to, do the crime. I think without LA, I don't think this movie even works.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. I mean, the majority of people here, I think, are transplants. People come here to be actors or writers, or to be in the business in some way. And a consistent theme and criticism is it's really hard for folks to find community, because you're in, like, you're the business, right? You're in entertainment if you are, but you're doing your own thing, and it's dog eat dog. And like, I was talking to an actor friend of mine, and she grew up here also, and it's like we're supposed to root for each other, but it's really like, oh, you're getting more jobs than me, so I'm envious of you. So it's really like the competition in LA is really challenging. And with sprawl, like the different neighborhoods are very specific, and so there are families that have grown up like East LA or South LA, or communities like that where it's more community oriented, but then there's other challenges. And so when you're here, like trying to do something, it's definitely a lonely city. And I think like the vastness of it, like you all had said, like that definitely is a character, or it feeds into it. I agree.
Yeah. And this has been a long running sort of social criticism, as like the historian, right, of LA, really ever since the post World War II period started, right? This sense that, like, the death of the walking city and the emergence of sprawl just sort of, inculcates this inherent sense of like human loneliness and disconnection from other people and lack of sort of criticism. And, some people debate whether or not that's, true, and to what extent it's sort of like overemphasized. But this is, like, in representations of films and things, like a common, sort of thing you interrogate or set something in LA when you want to explore these themes, right? Of like this sense that people feel alienated from other human beings and they have hard times forming, sort of stable relationships, or that they, generally are pursuing this sort of life of like solitude, right? Like LA is kind of the like iconic setting for that because that's supposed to be like what this landscape kind of engenders, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, like even like the whole, like as you were saying that, like, it's a car oriented city by design. So we don't have, I mean, it's better now than it ever was, but like we don't really have public transit where people are interacting. LA County, this is for my master's in public administration. LA County is 60 square miles, right? It's huge. So getting from one end to the other, that's over an hour. That's like 2 hours of driving, So yeah, it is very spread out. We are very isolated because we have to be in cars.
Yeah, there was something I was going to say is, I mean, well, one, I was thinking like LA did once have good public transportation in like the 1930s or, or so before,
the auto industry was like, yeah, screw that.
That's why, that's why people love noir, right? It's like that LA like 30s and 40s before the like suburban, like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you could just watch, if you watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you basically get a documentary inside of how the public transportation was destroyed. But anyway, I mean, I think that's not so untrue for other places that also don't have public transportation. Obviously, LA being this location of, the Hollywood and people trying to make it, and often more 99% of the time not making it, and then having to do something else. And you just become kind of this lost in a city, there. I think of a lot of, I think of some like Coen Brothers movies that take place in LA, and they kind of also have this theme of loneliness. And I'm sure you could probably come up with dozens and dozens more of that same thing. And I think that plays into all of these characters or especially De Niro, he is alone, but not, or wait, he is, he's lonely, but he's not alone. Like he has people, he has his crew.
The opposite, didn't he say?
Yeah, he's alone, but not lonely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll fix that later. No, but yeah, or I'll put the quote in. But yeah, I mean, I think it seems to be very true of, man does he like brings out the LA in this, I guess I feel like I'm just kind of repeating myself now, but like you can't do this without there being this LA backdrop, and everything about it is just, I don't know what else to say. It's just perfect.
I mean, I like the way they bring in, right? I mean, the scene at the harbor is so cool, right? Where Pacino
Mhm.
realizes, he's like watching him, and you get this great like, sort of aerial shot of like LA Harbor, and it's like it does kind of capture this just like, sort of the cool dynamics that you forget that like, almost all cities have these like these container sort of places and things like that. And like, yeah, it just adds like a really great sort of sense of place. That is like really well done. Obviously putting his house at the beach is another like, really
Yeah.
cool aesthetic choice they make, which although thinking about that, I was like, what is he renting this place? Like you can't own it. Like this guy was ready to pick up and leave at any minute. I was like, why would you rent a place? That must cost so much money to rent. Like, what are you thinking, man? Like,
Yeah, I assumed he must.
yeah,
I mean, they show it's kind of like a apartment or a condo or something. I mean, especially the fact that he has to be able to leave immediately. You wouldn't
Mhm.
think to own
yeah.
your place if you just got to bounce like immediately if the heat's coming around the corner.
I
So
mean, it looks like a
presumably,
house
yeah.
that probably today would go for like $30 to $40 or
Oh
something
yeah,
like
that's like
that.
that's
Right?
like Malibu Colony, right?
Yeah,
That's a Malibu beach house for
yeah,
sure. Which back in the '90s would have been probably 10 grand a month to rent. Um,
yeah.
I I,
Maybe
I
it's
actually
John.
happen to know.
Maybe it's John Voight's house, right? Like, who knows, right? Maybe it's the
Yeah.
Yeah.
fences,
Oh
like.
yeah, it could be sure
I
with a chair,
did
like
think it
there's
was
no front. Yeah.
interesting that he was living in such a luxurious spot, given his whole ethos is like you just pick up and like, sort of go at any minute. But yeah.
But it strikes me that he like moved there recently because he has no furniture, and it's almost like he probably had some, maybe something more, smaller and realistic, and he's been doing well, got lots of scores, and it's like, oh well, I guess I'll get this nicer place. But one of the other thing I was thinking about when we were talking about the loneliness and people to moving to LA, I think that the couldn't be more relevant is the Edie character who, when they meet in in like the diner, restaurant, whatever, at the bar, she describes how she had moved to LA. She wasn't from there, and
Yeah.
she's trying to essentially make it. I mean, she encapsulates that whole ethos of moving to LA. She seemed lonely. She works at a bookstore. She's maybe
Yeah.
has she makes menus for a restaurant. She doesn't really have much going on. Also, her apartment seems nicer than she should be able to afford.
Yeah, I was
to.
thinking that. Yeah, in the Hollywood Hills,
Yeah.
working at a bookstore. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's another interesting choice, though, to go back to that point is, I mean, they basically set that in like an old school cafeteria. And they literally sort of introduced those in places like LA in this post-war period for the fact that so many of them were like young single transients coming for like war jobs when LA started booming. And, you want a place where you could like get a cheap meal, but that essentially you didn't want to feel like lonely, right? So they invented the kind of cafeteria
Ah.
style, like big, lunch counter kind of thing. So that, right. And it's even hilarious, right? Because like, I mean, she tries to strike up a conversation with De Niro and he's like, what's your fucking problem, lady? Like, why are you like, you got both this like lonely grouch, but also this like crime guy, like, who are you? What are you, a cop? Right. But it's like, he's like, what do you care so much about what I'm reading? And she's just like, sorry, I was just trying to, have a conversation with you. It's like, it's actually a pretty funny scene in that regard. Like at how aggressively he responds, like this pretty woman asking him a question. Like,
But then it's interesting because he then within, a minute or two, realizing that she's no threat is now like, oh,
yeah,
he's immediately like, okay, I'm going to just drop all my guard. I'm going to go completely, forward here, see what you're like, see if you're a good person. It's almost as if he was looking for this, right? He was looking for someone to find. And so he could just have an excuse to walk away. And this gives him, that excuse. And I also didn't know that about the lunch counter. That's
yeah.
pretty cool.
Well, I think it goes back to like what you're saying about both them, right? Is like, it's clear that there is this desire to want more, to have, right? Like why else is Pacino even get married 3 times? Like you would obviously think
Yeah.
he would just not, right? But the sense that like, obviously they have some aspirations to not be like these lonely sad sacks, but ultimately like they can't help themselves, right? Like De Niro's whole final decision is that like he just could not help himself. He has the money, he has the girl, he's ready to take off, and like he just can't he can't help being who he is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that comes down to like those we were saying before is they have choices and they have agency over their choices, but in some ways it's almost like these decisions are kind of made for them. I mean, even though De Niro has this ethos of you can walk away, at the same time, I think above all that is his, I think I was saying before, like, does he actually love his crew? I think clearly he does, as you both said. He wouldn't have made that decision if not for, it was in his worst interest to do that. And he did it anyway. Like it gave away both his love interest and having happiness, his life, obviously, and all for the fact of, killing Waingro, who was a Nazi too. Didn't he have like swastikas on his face?
Yeah,
He deserved
or white
it.
power, I think, on his chest, something like that. Or no, it was a swastika. Yeah.
I think he did have one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
What's always funny to me too when you see this, because I remember I once had this conversation with a friend where someone was like, "Oh yeah, like I think that guy had like a swastika or a white power tattoo." I was like, "Yeah," I was like, it was just some like random person on the sort of street, and I was like, "Yeah, I see that." Although at times I kind of question, is this like a thing of ideology, or like that just more to me screams prison, right? Like it's just someone who's been to prison, and essentially like the gangs essentially coagulate in this way, right? Like you don't get the sense in the film that this dude's like, an ideologue so much as like prison culture just sort of, creates that kind of like universe of like this very racialized kind of, sort of like, politics and sort of gang behavior and things like that. But yeah.
I mean, he's obviously targeting a certain kind of person. Is he only targeting, did they say he's targeting black girls only, or they not
prostitutes?
Say?
Yeah, I don't know.
Remember. I know that they identify it as a serial killer. Like yeah, but I don't remember if.
Yeah.
I mean, they definitely don't paint him in a good light, even if these are, like from the very beginning, he's just, I don't know, him coming into the picture, the first time I watched it, the first time you watch it, you see him like joining the crew after he's at the little cafe. You're like, oh, this guy's going to fuck everything up, isn't he? Like, it's, you just know immediately that he's going to.
Well, it's also such an interesting question about like the freaks of fortune, right? That like they got this guy for this one job and like ends up being the, essentially this tweak that like brings everything crashing down on them. But
I wonder how they find him and they vetted him to be in this, because they, it's almost like against the, they bring some guy in.
Yeah.
But did they really need him in that scene? I don't really think he was even necessary. Like when I think about that robbery, like he wasn't driving the car. When they get out of the car, they don't really need a second guy holding the gun against the cops. They're just, their ears are like ringing. They can't do anything. I mean, it's one of those like, oh man.
I mean, I guess he was the main person like guarding the cops though, right? When looking for the money and sort of, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I mean, this is kind of this question of like, is this how this criminal underworld still kind of like functions or acts? Like, I mean, who knows?
This is probably how things were, I think of I don't know, obviously in a different era, but like Old West kind of bank robbing crews and, these kinds of things, or even like the beginning of the 20th century, the 20s. But again, that's also, like you're saying before, a lot of it's like organized crime, especially in the 20th century. But either way, as you said before, like it still makes for a hell of a compelling.
I mean, I love the idea that there are these like, tight knit, family like crews that are out like, committing like high. I mean, how often do bank robberies even? Do you even know this, Matthew? Like how often do bank robberies like armored truck? Like how often do things like this even occur?
Especially like that, with the explosives and the cement truck that knocks over the money truck and the
call just went out. 3 minutes. We got to go.
So this is from like the most simple Google search, but according to the FBI website, there were 1,400 bank robberies in 2022.
Wow.
Okay. Wow.
But obviously not the kind you're like.
I imagine most of these kind of like attempted smash and grab jobs.
Commercial
like
banks. Yeah, it says those are commercial banks. And it says there's only was one armored carrier robbery in the year 2022. So as you're saying, like they were going into a small bank, tell them the old stick them up, give me the money behind the counter, and they run out. So I wonder how I don't know. I'm like looking. This only shows back to 2003, so it's not really. But it seems like that's 6,000 commercial bank robberies in 2003. That seems like a lot.
Yeah,
not the same. I'm sure it wasn't De Niro leading that crew.
Yeah, if you think about it in like its simplest premise, like it is something that any goofball could try, right? Just like walk into a bank and be like, "Give me the money," right? Like, yeah, I'm sure.
Like a
maybe it
small
is
town too, where there's no cops really.
I'm saying like I'm just sure that like it probably does happen way more than we'd expect, but most of it's just like stupid petty criminals trying to do something that is a really freaking bad idea.
Yeah. And it says in the 2004 when there were 6,600 commercial bank robberies, it says they stole $62 million, and they only recovered $9 million. So they got away with quite a bit there. That's a pretty good.
I tend to think that maybe a large number of those robberies are, like somebody going up to a teller and being like, "I have a gun, give me the money you have there," and then they're gone. Versus like 3, 4, 5 people, coming in with like rifles and holding up the whole place and like that.
Well, it's actually funny. This actually breaks down the type of area in the bank where it was robbed. So in this 2004. Of the 8,000 robberies, it says that 7,300 of them were counter robberies. So like you're saying, they go up to the counter and they steal the money. Yeah. And only 390 were like vault or safe robberies. So, there's mostly exactly what you're saying. Like how many, it's hard to rob a safe. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. You don't have, James Caan from Thief there at your disposal.
As my playing of Red Dead Redemption recently has taught me, it's not easy.
Is there anything that I either missed or things about the film or scenes that I didn't talk about that you wanted to get to?
As a funny side note, after seeing that movie in '95, there was a coffee place down the street that had an ATM, but it was like a freestanding ATM, and my friend was like, "We should go steal that. We'll throw it in the back of your car." I'm like, "I'm not stealing an ATM." It's like, no, we'll just put it in the back of your car. Because anybody can do it.
Yeah, I was like, you'll never be able to. What then?
I don't know, but
yeah.
But it does seem like one of those things where it wouldn't be so. I mean, I guess the problem now is actually getting away, given how there's surveillance cameras everywhere. Like in this movie, they have that. They do it under a bridge, and they, probably they said they disabled the cameras or whatever. So it's so much harder to do that kind of crime. Just like how I think of how serial killers and those kind of things really dropped off in the the end of the 80s when you had DNA evidence.
DNA was introduced. Yeah.
It was impossible to get away with those things. Or if there were beginnings of serial killers, they were caught right away, as opposed to 10 killers in,
20 bodies in, essentially. Yeah,
no more like Jack the Rippers or whatever.
Well, we never caught that dude, so.
That's true, yeah. I guess I think of, I don't know, Manson, or I can't think of any good ones.
Like
the Zodiac Killer.
We had like then like Hillside, like there was one or a couple years, forget if it was late 80s or I think it was late 80s, where we had like the Hillside Strangler and the Night Stalker, and there were like several serial killers in Los Angeles, and it was a big deal. Like I remember seeing that as a kid on TV. I was like, "Oh shit!"
Richard Ramirez, right? Like, his ending is crazy. Like a bunch of people on the street just recognize him and like beat him up and capture him because his face is like all over the news. Like that story's wild. That always like. Yeah, it's always so interesting.
It seems like some of the people like criminal, like I think of, there's another one, I think that's in what was that HBO show that was on for just a couple seasons? Well, at the beginning of the FBI, it got canceled.
Oh yeah, the profiler one.
Yeah, I can't think of. I think some of those are based on real serial killers, and a lot of times like they do something really random and obvious, and that's how they get something out of their character, and then they get caught. So it's always these. I guess you could say
is profiling even real?
Profiling?
Though?
I don't think so. I think it's
it strikes me as kind of like pseudoscience that like they can come up with the personality. Right? I don't know. I mean,
it does seem like it's all very. I am no expert on it, so I don't want to speak out of term, but I would expect a lot of it to be kind of finding explanations based on or I don't know, fitting a narrative around something that already exists or something.
Yeah. Well, it's so devastating if you like watch true crime when you then go and like look at so much of this forensic stuff and you're like, oh, this is kind of not actually very reputable the way they like make it out to be. But yeah.
Definitely not. But yeah, I don't know. Do you have any other last thoughts and before we wrap it up?
No, it's been fun.
No, this has been great. It's been it's been a lot of fun. I don't get to talk about like dissect movies, and I like movies and music, so this has been really great for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Keith and Matthew, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And you can find your content, Matthew. I'll link below to find your documentary and your socials and such. But yeah, thanks to you both for joining.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you can find, this podcast and all the podcast places on the internet, and catch you next time.